Why do you want her more the colder she gets? Not despite the rejection, but because of it. You're not falling in love. You're chasing the feeling of finally being enough for someone who never saw you. This isn't about her, not really. It's about the absence she leaves behind, the emotional vacuum you scramble to fill with meaning, projection, and persistence. The more distant she becomes, the more intense your desire, not because she's rare, but because her disinterest activates something ancient in you. Schopenhauer called it the will to life, that insatiable blind force driving us to pursue, to possess, to survive. But when that will is distorted through early emotional wounds, it mutates. It stops seeking life and starts reenacting pain again and again. Stay with this, because the part of you that calls it love isn't lying. It's just using the wrong word for the right wound. There's a strange phenomenon most men never question. We become obsessed with the ones who don't choose us. She doesn't return your texts. She cancels plans. She looks through you in group conversations, and yet she's the one who stays in your mind, the one who becomes the fantasy, the one whose attention, if you could just earn it, would finally mean you're worthy. Attraction becomes a riddle you have to solve. Her silence becomes a puzzle you need to decode, and every act of neglect deepens the illusion that winning her would be a kind of inner redemption. But this isn't romantic, it's psychological recursion. You are not falling in love with her, you are falling back into yourself. Rejection for most is a signal to move on, but for men raised in inconsistent emotional climates, where love was earned, not given, it does something else. It ignites the old script, one that says, I'm not enough yet, but if I try harder, if I become more, maybe this time I'll be loved. And so you try. Not because she's extraordinary, but because she feels familiar. Her indifference doesn't turn you away. It draws you in because it mirrors the earliest version of love you were taught. A love laced with condition, unpredictability, and performance. This is the foundation of emotional repetition compulsion. Freud named it, but Schopenhauer lived inside it. He believed that desire itself was suffering, not because we chase pleasure, but because we chase illusions, fantasies we mistake for freedom, people we mistake for answers. And what's more illusory than convincing yourself someone cold and avoidant will finally love you if you just endure long enough? The problem is this: even if she gives in, the script doesn't end. It resets, because it was never about the woman. It was about the role she played, the validation you were promised, the relief you projected onto her face. And once she becomes available, once she sees you, the craving dissipates. You stop wanting her, not because she changed, but because she's no longer the symbol. This is the cruel cycle. You pursue those who withhold love, not in spite of the withholding, but because of it. You're not chasing connection, you're chasing resolution, not of the relationship, but of yourself. And as long as the pattern stays unconscious, your attraction will remain misdirected. You will keep calling it love when it's really memory. You will keep calling it chemistry when it's really pain. You will keep calling it fate when it's just the familiar shape of your original wound. In the next section, we go deeper into where that wound begins and why, without knowing it, you've been trying to rewrite your own childhood through the women you pursue. Make sure you stay, because once you see that origin clearly, the entire pattern starts to unravel. To understand why her indifference feels magnetic, you have to go back, not to your last relationship, but to the first emotional environment you ever knew. We don't fall for people, we fall into patterns, and those patterns are shaped long before romance ever enters the picture. Most of us were never explicitly taught what love was. We felt it through tone of voice, consistency, withdrawal, warmth, punishment, or praise. And for boys, especially those raised in environments where emotional needs were inconvenient, mocked, or inconsistently met, love often took on a shape that was difficult to trust, but impossible to stop craving. This is where the foundation is laid. The idea that love is not a given, but a reward. That connection must be earned through performance. That warmth is fleeting, and approval comes only after you've become what someone else needed. In this landscape, neglect becomes normal, and unpredictability becomes addictive. You learn that the person who withholds affection is the one who defines your worth. Their validation doesn't just feel good, it feels like life. And every time it's delayed, the craving intensifies. So later, when you meet a woman who shows signs of disinterest, your body doesn't recoil. It leans in, because you've felt this before, not in love, but in childhood. The loop is unconscious, but its logic is exact. If I can get her to choose me, maybe that proves I was always worth choosing. This is the emotional blueprint of starvation bonding. The more someone withholds affection, the more value we assign them, because we've learned to equate love with lack. When someone is kind to us, it feels neutral, maybe even suspicious. But when someone is distant, critical, or unavailable, it awakens the system. The pursuit begins. This isn't your fault, but it is your pattern, and the longer it stays unnamed, the more sophisticated it becomes. You begin to intellectualize it. You say you're drawn to mysterious women, that you like a challenge, that you're not into girls who are too easy. But these aren't preferences. They're cover stories. You don't want ease. You want redemption. You don't want love. You want evidence. Proof that you were never as unworthy as you once felt. Schopenhauer, in his essays on human will, warned that what we desire often enslaves us, that the more we crave, the less freedom we have. And nowhere is this more visible than in the man who is haunted by the need to be chosen by someone who continues to withhold herself. That's not desire, that's conditioning. And the worst part, you're not even chasing her. You're chasing a version of yourself that might finally feel complete, if only she gave you what you've been missing. But she can't, not because she's cruel, because she's not the source of the wound. She's just its mirror. In the next section, we explore what happens when your ego takes over, and why the very act of winning her back might be the most seductive form of self-destruction. That part won't make sense now, but it will soon. When she ignores your message, it hurts. But when she finally replies, it feels euphoric. Not because of what she said, but because she said anything at all. This is how the ego keeps the cycle alive. It assigns spiritual significance to the bare minimum. A glance, a half laugh, a text after 3 days, and suddenly you feel chosen, important, desired. But you're not in love. You're in withdrawal, and she just gave you your hit. This is the darker truth. The obsession isn't about her at all. It's about how your ego feels in proximity to her rejection. Her disinterest isn't a barrier, it's the fuel. The less she gives, the more the ego needs to conquer. Because if you can make her want you, then maybe you can finally silence the part of yourself that still believes you're not enough. You don't want connection, you want proof. And so every cold reply becomes a challenge. Every delay in affection becomes an invitation to try harder. Every emotional distance becomes a test the ego is determined to pass. But the more you chase, the more distorted your perception becomes. You stop seeing her as a person. She becomes a mirror, reflecting your unhealed need, a trophy, a symbol, a reward. And once that projection begins, nothing she says or does matters, because you're no longer interacting with her. You're interacting with your own unresolved story. Schopenhauer warned that the will is never satisfied, that we pursue not because we truly want, but because we lack. And this lack is not neutral, it's invasive. It doesn't leave you alone. It rewrites your values, your attention, your entire perception of intimacy. In this state, the ego becomes addicted to rejection, not because it enjoys pain, but because pain offers the chance for triumph. If she continues to withhold, then the story can continue. And if the story continues, then the fantasy remains alive, that one day you'll finally be seen. But that fantasy is poison, because even if you win her, you won't feel complete. The ego will celebrate for a moment, but almost immediately, the illusion will dissolve. The conquest was the high, and now that it's over, you're left with a person, a human being who may never live up to the emotional myth you built around her silence. This is the moment many men sabotage the relationship. They pull away, they lose interest, not because she changed, but because the script ended. The truth is this: you were never obsessed with her. You were obsessed with rewriting the first time you felt invisible. And the ego doesn't want love. It wants victory, especially over the ghosts it couldn't defeat the first time. In the next section, we examine how projection turns her into something she never was, and why you're not in love with a woman, but with a narrative you've been rehearsing for years. Stay with this, because it shifts from memory to myth. She never said she could fix you. She never promised warmth. She never offered a future. But somewhere along the way, you gave her those lines anyway. You assigned her the role. You filled in the blanks. You took her silence as mystery, her distance as depth, and her coldness as power. And you convinced yourself it was love, but it wasn't her. It was a story, and she was just standing in the middle of it. This is the nature of projection. It turns people into props. It strips them of ambiguity and reassembles them as symbols of what we want most and fear we'll never receive. We don't fall in love with them. We fall in love with what they represent. You didn't desire her. You desired what her approval would mean. You didn't miss her. You missed the way her absence made you feel desperate and alive. This illusion is powerful. And men trapped in emotional hunger often build their entire inner world around it. She becomes the fantasy redeemer, the one who could finally reverse the verdict passed down in childhood, that you weren't enough, that you were too much, that love is earned only through suffering. And the tragedy is this: she never had to be anything real. She only had to be unavailable. Because the more absent she became, the more room your mind had to invent her. Schopenhauer wrote that every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world. And nowhere is that blindness more destructive than in romantic obsession. Your vision narrows. You stop seeing the red flags. You stop seeing her ambivalence. You stop seeing yourself. Instead, you see a fantasy forged from fragments, a smile in January, a long conversation in May, an almost kiss that never became more. You splice them together like a trailer for a film that never got made and never will. And this projection doesn't fade when she's gone. It deepens, because absence preserves the illusion better than reality ever could. You replay the moments, you rewrite them, you analyze texts, you search for subtext that was never there. And in doing so, you feed the fantasy, because to let it go would mean admitting something even harder than rejection, that she was never who you thought she was. You weren't in love, you were in longing, and longing is the perfect illusion because it never has to confront the truth that she is not the answer, that she never held the key, that the real healing isn't in being chosen by her, it's in stepping out of the story where her love ever mattered that much. In the next section, we confront the moment after the fantasy collapses, when you finally win her, and discover the most disorienting realization of all, that you don't actually want her anymore. And it's not because she changed. You finally got what you wanted. She said yes. She came closer. She started texting back, meeting you halfway, showing softness. And that's when the obsession died. Not with closure, not with peace, with boredom. The very moment she stepped off the pedestal and became real, something inside you collapsed. The hunger disappeared, the urgency faded, and now, though you won, you feel nothing. This is the death of the fantasy. Not because she did anything wrong, but because the myth can't survive exposure. The moment she becomes human, she stops being the symbol. And without that symbol, the spell breaks. You didn't love her. You loved the chase. You loved the meaning you attached to her silence. You loved how her rejection kept the illusion alive, that one day you'd be enough. And now that she's here, there's nothing left to prove. No script to perform, no puzzle to decode, no wound to animate. Schopenhauer understood this. He believed that desire was not a pursuit of pleasure, but an escape from pain. And once the object of desire is obtained, the pain ceases, and so does the meaning. What once felt like purpose now feels hollow. The ego, having conquered the target, retreats into restlessness. It needs a new symbol. This is why some men ruin what they chased for years. They self-sabotage, they ghost, they pick fights, not because they hate her, but because her presence can't support the weight of their fantasy. She becomes a mirror they no longer need. And without that reflection, the ego starves. So it seeks again, another woman, another mystery, another chance to prove what was never proved the first time. The pattern resets because the underlying script was never rewritten. And the cost? Women get hurt, relationships get fractured, and the man continues to mistake conquest for intimacy. It's not that you were lying when you said you loved her. It's that your definition of love was still entangled with proof, with ego, with resolution. You didn't want her. You wanted what her approval represented. But here's the hard part. No woman, no matter how kind or cruel, can give you that, because it's not hers to give. It never was. In the final section, we confront what happens when you finally realize this, when you see the fantasy, the ego, and the wound as one continuous loop, and you decide for the first time to step out of it. Because the end of obsession isn't apathy, it's authorship. There's a moment most men avoid their entire lives. Not the rejection, not the heartbreak, but the realization that the woman who shattered them was never that powerful to begin with. She wasn't a goddess. She was a placeholder, a canvas you painted with every unmet need, every unresolved wound, every silent prayer for recognition that was never answered in childhood. And once the projection fades, what remains is not just her absence, but the frightening clarity that it was never really about her. That's the moment you meet yourself, not the version of you that performs or persuades or proves, but the one who carried that script so long he forgot it was optional. This is the fracture where healing begins. Not in bitterness, not in new tactics, not in pretending you don't care, but in the slow, brutal work of confronting how you've built your self-worth around being chosen. Because if you only feel valuable when she wants you, then you were never the one holding the pen. You were always waiting for a woman to write your worth into existence. Schopenhauer would call this the tyranny of the will, a hunger so deep it makes slaves of men. But it can end, not with a victory, not with a woman finally turning toward you, but with a refusal to chase symbols that will never love you back. The pattern is seductive. It feels like desire. It moves like passion, but it always collapses into the same question: why do I only feel alive when I'm being denied? That question isn't rhetorical, it's revealing, because it points to something beneath the ego, something older, more tender, more afraid. And when you sit with that, really sit with it, not as a flaw to be fixed, but as a fracture to be seen, you begin to reclaim something. Not power, not dominance, not appeal, but authorship. The ability to choose not just who you want, but why. To feel desire without turning it into proof. To walk away from women who remind you of the pain you once mistook for love. Because here's the truth. If she doesn't love you and you still can't let go, it was never about her. It was about the part of you that still needs to be loved by someone who won't. And once that part is seen, it can stop reaching, it can stop chasing, it can finally rest. So the next time you feel that obsession rise, ask yourself, is this love, or is this the story trying to start again? And more importantly, what happens if you don't follow it this time?